can't actually see my little synagogue logo. So there you go. Sorry about that. Anyways, shalom. Welcome all. Very happy to have you guys here today. This is an episode of the Watchdog. If you guys do like this content, please do hit that like button while you're here. Let me know that you're here in the live chat. Share this to your different social media so that we can actually get this message out to people. And of course, we appreciate your subscription. Our pre-article discussion for today, which I'm going to sort of waste a little bit of time so that we can wait for more people to show up if they can. Our pre-article discussion for today is actually going to be about the exact same stuff that the articles that we're going to be talking about will be about today. And that is the United States debt. I listened to a speech by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, Republican from Kentucky, today. And we're actually going to listen to it over the course of this episode. And it inspired me to discuss a little bit about the United States debt and specifically the deficit that we actually have this year, which is unbelievably high. Both of those things, the debt and the deficit this year, are unbelievably high. Now, to differentiate, just so you guys are aware, the debt, I am talking about the total accumulation of United States debt, and deficit, I'm just talking about for this year. So to give you guys a little bit of background real quick before I get too ahead of myself. And shalom, Brother Nicholas. I see you are in the live chat there. To backtrack a little bit before I get ahead of myself, they passed, and by they, I mean the United States Congress, passed a COVID stimulus bill today. The bill is roughly $900 billion in stimulus and spending. Excuse me. It is expected to come with a roughly $600 check for all the different, citizens, as well as $300 added to unemployment. And of course, we'll get to a lot of the details as to what exactly that means later on here in the program. But basically just more quote unquote stimulus spending to try and, I guess, bail out the economy after these disastrous lockdowns completely decimated our labor force, our small businesses, our means of production, so on and so forth, right? And the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, had a speech here today about this stimulus bill before it had been passed, because it has been passed, talking about the dangers of not only this massive spending bill, but also the other massive spending bills that we have been pushing forward or pushing through, or whatever you want to term it, this year. The United States debt this year, it was quoted by the senator as being $3.3 trillion in deficit for this year. I'm using the word debt, I meant deficit. If this $900 billion is just pure deficit, that would increase that to 4.2. I have an article that we're going to read today that puts it at 3.1. So if this is pure deficit, that would put it at 4. This is not only the largest single year deficit we've ever had. The deficit that we currently have this year is actually greater than the what would you call that? The revenue of the government this year. In other words, it's one thing to have a revenue of, say, $3 trillion, and then you have a deficit of $600 billion or something like that, right? You're obviously spending more money than you have. But now imagine you have a revenue of $3 trillion, and then you have a deficit of 3.1 or higher trillion dollars. That's what we actually did this year. And our debt at this point, I believe it's around $28 trillion, quickly approaching 30 trillion. Of course, the incredibly disappointing thing about this is that the quote unquote conservatives that make up the Republican Party were supposed to be doing something about this, specifically in 2017, 2018, when they had control of the Senate and House of Representatives, as well as, of course, the presidency with President Donald J. Trump. But now here we are. The bill has been passed. We're adding more to the debt, continuously, of course, raising that debt ceiling, right? We're just creating money basically out of thin air, which at least at one point in time they were honest, like William Jennings Bryan back when he said that we should just be basically purposefully inflating the dollar, right? At least he was honest about it. At least that's, he admitted that that's what he wanted. Nowadays, we try to pass it off as this stimulus that's going to quote unquote stimulate the economy. When, of course, $600 is a pittance. And by the way, that's another thing I do want to point out while we're here. Isn't it funny that when the government is paying everybody's rent, the government can't actually pay anybody's rent, right? $600 doesn't pay virtually anybody in this country's rent. It certainly doesn't get food on the table on top of that, right? If you actually do need some kind of a bailout from somebody, the government check just isn't going to cut it, right? And yet people actually want this through the form of UBI and stuff like that. But nonetheless, I am getting ahead of myself. So this is what we're going to be talking about, because basically he made this comment, and I'm sorry that I'm a little bit disjointed. It is late, and I wanted to get this done earlier, but I had, tons of delays and stuff like that, so I apologize. But Rand Paul made this comment in the speech we're going to listen to, where he said, somebody's going to point out that the emperor has no clothes, meaning that the dollar doesn't have any value. And it just occurred to me while listening to him point out that somebody will eventually point out that the emperor has no clothes, that indeed the entire empire has run out of material with which to make the clothes. Right? What are we actually printing at this point? Honestly, we don't act like the money that we are putting forward, it isn't actually tangible currency, right? We're making it out of thin air. There's nothing to back it. And to give you guys kind of a simple illustration, right? If everybody starts with $0, the first person to get $1 all of a sudden is rich, right? If everybody has $1,000, then the person who's going to get 2,000 or 3,000 or 10,000, he's rich. That's the way that wealth works. It doesn't really matter how much money you have as far as the gross total, right? If everybody around you has a significantly lower amount of money than you do, then you're rich. But if you start piling a bunch of money into the system, the only thing you do is make that number of dollars that it takes to accumulate in order to become wealthy, rich, or even well off. You make that number higher because there's now more dollars in circulation. There's now a higher zero, quote unquote, if you will, right? And we have gotten to the point, at least this year, where we're up to potentially $4 trillion in money that we printed out of thin air and put into circulation via our wonderful Federal Reserve System. That will come back to haunt us at some point. You think we're just going to have this 2.1% inflation that everybody keeps complaining about? You're tripping. You are straight up tripping. We are going to have ridiculous inflation at some point. I don't know when that point is, but there's going to come a point in time when your milk is quite literally, and in fact, let me give you a perfect example of this, actually. Maxwell House Coffee Company is already experiencing some of this. Those of you who buy Maxwell House coffee might have already actually seen what I'm talking about. Their coffee has gone up in price 3.5 times at this point. 3.5 times. It's something that was $3-4 to buy is now $10-12. Depending on where you are, it gets even higher than that, right? Like I said, in some cases, 3.5 times, which would be, if I'm doing the math correctly with that 4, I think it would be $14, right? And that's just one example with somebody who's experiencing it now. Eggs went from roughly $1.50 to $3. We've seen the milk prices starting to rise. We've seen meat prices starting to rise, right? Everybody's prices are starting to go up a little bit. So you're already starting to see small amounts of this inflation. I'm sorry, once again, I'm a little bit disjointed in the conversation tonight, but I hope you guys are getting the point that I'm articulating it properly. People will not be able to survive this kind of inflation. You're making the amount of money that you need to accumulate in order to be well off too big for the middle class, for the lower class to actually be able to attain to. And this is something that has been very well known, not only by simpletons like myself, right? But very wise, very well-known economists, Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, Who's the gentleman who's been trying, Peter Schiff, right? He's been trying to get everybody to buy gold recently, which, by the way, I don't know if it's even a good idea to endorse anymore, because at this point, you know, it's like that you see gold at an ounce is like $1,900, $2,000, something like that, right? It almost makes you wonder, like, has the boom already happened? But maybe not. At any rate, that's not the point, right? These other economists, they've known this for quite some time. They've been warning about this for quite some time. David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son, been warning about this for quite some time, right? This is a very well-known fact. You can't just inflate the currency ad infinitum and expect that you're going to just buy everybody out of debt with money that doesn't exist. That's just not how the economy works. And we're going to get into some of the details now, because I don't just want to ramble on forever. We've already been here for 11 minutes, it looks like. And I want to listen to this speech here by the Senator Rand Paul, where he explains much more articulately than I did, right? Why this is a problem, the ridiculous amount of debt that we have, the ridiculous amount of deficit that we have this year, right? Something that our Republican politicians did nothing to solve, by the way. I just want to point that out to all of my fellow conservatives. I am your brother, politically speaking. However, let's just be honest about this. Whether it be President Donald Trump, or whether it be the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, or whether it be the, well, I don't know who's the Senate Minority Leader at this point, or whatever you call the equivalent to whip. I don't know. But obviously it was Paul Ryan before it was Nancy Pelosi, right? Or the guy who was before McConnell, Boehner, whatever his name was, right? Doesn't matter who these people are. None of them are actually doing their job. None of them actually did what we expected them to do on any of these fields, whether it's the pro-life field, whether it's the getting our boys home field, or whether it's the field that we're talking about here today, right? Which is getting the debt under control. So just make sure you're calling them out. But anyways, I digress. I want to listen to this speech here from Rand Paul, show you guys what the senator has to say. I think it is very important. I'm going to go ahead and share screen and audio here. I see also Smokey Saint is in the chat. Shalom, brother. All right. Excuse me for that, friends. So here is the video here. We're going to go ahead and put it on full screen. This is the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, been senator since 2011, son of Ron Paul, who is the famous Texas representative, represented, excuse me, I believe Texas's 14th district from 1995 to 2013. Excuse me, again, 13. He's very well known for pushing a incredibly libertarian understanding of the Constitution. And a very originalist understanding of the Constitution for his entire tenure in Congress, which did actually begin before 1995. That was actually the second time that he had a tenure in Congress, but I'm not too sure on the dates before then. He had run for president, of course, in 1988, 2008, and 2012. And Rand actually himself ran for president in 2016, losing the Republican nomination to, of course, President Donald Trump. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and see what the senator had to say today before we pass this absolutely egregious $900 billion spending bill.
The senator from Kentucky.
Republicans like to mock modern monetary theory, the idea that government can print money with impunity, that government can spend whatever it wants without the need to tax. Modern monetary theory is basically the Dick Cheney deficits don't matter crowd, trussed up with a new fancy title. Most Republicans rightly lampoon this quackery. That is, when they're not practicing the quackery themselves.
And of course, that's what one of the things that I was just addressing. So I just want to go ahead and address it a little bit right now. The senator has pointed it out, and it is something that we, the people, need to be firmly aware of. We need to hold our politicians accountable for all of the garbage that not only that they say, but specifically that they do. Because a lot of times they actually are saying the right things, right? They're saying, oh, we want to deal with the debt. Oh, we want to go ahead and make sure that we're not having a deficit every year. We want to solve the trade deficit. We want to make sure that that everybody's, having a good job and the economy's thriving and blah, 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 blah. And then, of course, the situation that we're in right now ends up being the situation that we're in when we have, 94 million some odd people were out of the workforce at the peak. of this year, which is a record, where we have this 3.1 to 4.2 trillion dollar. We're not entirely sure on the numbers yet. Deficit in a single year, more than the revenue that our government has for the single year. When we have a 128% a debt, excuse me, of 128% of our total GDP, so on and so forth, right? And none of these so-called conservatives, these so-called Republicans, have done anything about it, right? They had the House of Representatives and the Senate for quite some time. They had the House of Representatives since 2011, right? They won in the 2010 elections after President Barack Obama had won his first stint in office, right, back in 2008. The Republicans took the House at that point in 2010 and managed to keep the House all throughout the Obama presidency, and for the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, nothing. That's the facts, right? You, the voter, need to do something with those facts if you want to preserve your country, which at this point, I do want to be clear. I don't know if it's necessarily possible to preserve our economy. I think our economy will inevitably collapse at some point. It might be possible to rebuild the economy, but I think that the monetary system that we currently have based off of the Federal Reserve and the Keynesian economic theory, I think they will absolutely collapse within the lifetime of most of the people who are listening to this particular video. But I digress. I just want people to understand not only what I'm saying, but what the senator is saying here, right? We do need to hold these so-called conservatives accountable because they accomplish absolutely nothing even when they have the power, which implies that they're not actually conservatives, but indeed just grifters, just quacks, just people who want your money, who want your vote, who want the power, right? Let's go ahead and continue.
Today, many of these same Republicans will vote for a bill that makes modern monetary theory look like child's play in comparison. The monster spending bill presented today is not just a deficits don't matter disaster. It is everything Republicans say they don't believe in.
And again, let's just be clear. This was a $900 billion spending bill on top of the 3.3 trillion. It's somewhere between 3.1 and 3.3 trillion at this time. Deficit, $3.3 trillion deficit that we already have, right? We had $900 billion on top of that. That the $900 billion by itself in a spending bill would be considered very problematic just last year. But now we're adding that onto $3.3 trillion in deficit.
This bill is free money for everyone. Proponents don't care if you're fully employed or own your own house or own your own business. Free money for everyone, they cry. And yet, if free money were the answer, if money really grew on trees, why not give more free money? Why not give it out all the time? Why stop at $600 a person? Why not $1,000?
And let's just remember that is something that is not just this crazy hypothetical from this kook named Rand Paul who happens to sit in the Senate because some rednecks down in Kentucky managed to vote this guy in, right? That's actually a proposal from somebody who was actually running in the 2020 Democratic primaries, Andrew Yang, who said that he wanted universal basic income or a check from the government for every American for $1,000 every single month. Just saying. By the way, for the record, this same Andrew Yang now wants you to have some sort of a barcode on your phone or passport in order to ensure that you actually have the COVID-19 vaccine so that you're allowed to go into public venues. I kid you not. He has actually proposed that both on Twitter and on CNN, where he is a contributor.
Why not $2,000? Maybe these new free money Republicans should join the Everybody Gets a Guaranteed Income caucus. Why not $20,000 a year for everybody? Why not $30,000? If we can print up money with impunity, why not do it? The Treasury can just keep printing the money. That is, until someone points out that the emperor has no clothes and that the...
And again, I would just point out that when he says until somebody points out the emperor has no clothes, which is ironic, of course, because he's in the process of doing that right now. I would like to point out that it is much worse than that. The empire has no cloth. How could the emperor possibly have a garment of his own when the empire has completely run out of cloth, when the textile mills are empty? The cotton farmers farm cotton no more. I'm sure you get the analogy by now. We're bankrupt. We don't have money anymore. We have a deficit every single year. The last time we did not have a deficit was 1994. Friends, I was not even born yet, would not be born for another 4 years. I'm sure there's listeners of this broadcast who also were not born yet. I'm fairly certain it's probably a substantial number of them, right? I mean, think about it. That's 26 years since we've actually had a balanced budget. $27 trillion in debt. I used to listen to, because I used to be really interested in just political radicals just to see what made them radical. So I'd listen to guys like Malcolm X and, of course, Martin Luther King would be considered a radical, and Mayor Kahana, right? And Joe Vogler from the Alaska Independence Party and all this kind of stuff, right? And consistently, people who had a radical bent against the United States, it's interesting, back in the 70s and 80s, they were bringing up the United States debt. And it's just mind-boggling to think about. I mean, Ross Perot in 1992 was running primarily on this idea that we need to fight the debt, right? And yet here we are. We've continuously added to this debt for years upon years upon years upon years. And now we are spending trillions upon trillions of dollars in a single year that we don't have, printing it out of thin air to prop up an economy that doesn't even really exist. And it's only a matter of time before it collapses in on itself. The senator is going to actually give the precise figure. So you'll forgive the fact that I don't know the exact number, but there's like $120 some odd $1,000 that every single person on the entire, or in the entire country, rather, I was going to say on the entire country, in the entire country actually technically owes in debt at this point. That's how deep into debt we are. 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years. We owe 27 of those in dollars. 27 of those. I mean, that's completely insane. It's absurd. According to the evolutionist model, that's longer than the human race has even been around as Homo sapien sapien.
Dollar no longer has value. To so-called conservatives who are quick to identify the socialism of Democrats, if you vote for this spending monstrosity, you are no better. When you vote to pass out free money, you lose your soul and you abandon forever any semblance of moral or fiscal integrity. And
we need to point out a couple things here. Number one, if you're passing out free money, then the question, and by the way, the liberals have been asking it since the first stimulus check was passed, right? If you're giving out free money, the question immediately becomes, why can't you keep giving out free money? If you have $12,000 to give to every American, $24,000 if they're married, plus money to give to unemployment, plus money to give to the small business fund, plus $600 to every American in a stimulus check later on down the year, plus, of course, all the other spending that you're going to do anyways. If you actually have that money, why can't you give everybody college? Why can't you give everybody daycare, pre-K? Everybody gets health insurance. Everybody gets house insurance. Everybody gets universal basic income. Everybody gets to, get their, I don't know, favorite movie at freaking Walmart or something. Like whatever your heart desires at this point, people can start to promise you. Because the question becomes, why not? You did X, why can't you do Y? As if that's actually a valid argument. As if that actually explains, well, how are you going to pay for this? Well, you paid for X, so why can't you pay for Y? Okay, that didn't actually explain how I'm going to pay for Y. You just basically engaged in a too cool quail whataboutism, saying, well, this happened, but the thing is that's the way people work, and that's actually what's going to happen, and it's already what's happening now. But also from the moral perspective, he says you lose any semblance of moral integrity, I think is the exact phraseology he used. That's 100% correct. Because we need to understand the debt, the United States debt, is theft. It is theft. If you take a debt that you never intend on paying back, that's theft. Can your debts be forgiven? Of course. Even your thefts can be forgiven. But again, let's call a spade a spade. If you take a debt that you have no intention or even possibility of paying back, that is theft. Theft is immoral. In fact, if you're a Christian, and of course I am, and I assume the vast majority of listeners to this podcast are, theft is against God's law. It's a sin. That's what the United States government is engaged in on a national level every single year.
Next time you see Republicans in high moral dudgeon claiming and complaining about spending of Democrats and socialism, remind them if they supported this monstrous bill that really the difference between the parties is less Adam Smith versus Marx and more Marx versus Engels.
Brief context, Adam Smith is considered to be the godfather of capitalist economic theory. And of course, Karl Marx, the founder of Marxism. Engels is the famous friend of Karl Marx who co-wrote the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital with him. And is considered really to be a co-founder of Marxism and ergo communism and socialism as a result. And of course, he's exactly right. There's actually a quote that I think should be famous, but unfortunately it's not, by Idaho perennial candidate Walter Bays, who's actually the 2018 Constitution Party candidate for governor here in Idaho. Obviously very small, but nonetheless, he when he was running in, I believe, 2010 or 14 for the Republican Party nomination for governor here in Idaho, he said half the Republicans are Democrats and half the Democrats are communists. And of course, that's kind of similar and in the same vein. You know, you get this idea that the parties are essentially just two heads of the same hydra. And of course, it's exactly accurate. This bill just proves that it's exactly accurate. And eventually we are going to get to a Republican Party that is so liberalized that they will start passing all these massive spending bills for things like free college, for things like free education, pre-K all the way up to college even, for things like your free, what do they call that? Health insurance, excuse me, right? Potentially even greater than that, life insurance, housing insurance, car insurance, right? And of course, free with asterisks and air quotes and, you know, fine print and etc. But I digress. And of course, when it comes to reminding them, the people who need to do the reminding, I just want to remind everybody, no pun intended, that's you. You remind your local politicians, about their duty to the Constitution, to the integrity of this economy, to the integrity of this nation, to the moral fabric of this nation, to keeping us afloat to future generations, as well as to the generations who elected them now, right? And both with your dollar and with your vote, you get to control whether or not those people remain in office, or whether or not they get any political career at all, for that matter. It's literally in the palm of your hands. So you don't just have to remind these people. You can destroy these people from a political perspective if you really want to. And I do mean from a political perspective. We are peaceful people. And frankly, we have limited time to do so. If we do have time at all, only God knows. But just to reiterate, remind them, and by remind them, I mean you, the people listening to this broadcast, remind your politicians who they work for, which again is you. So you do the reminding, and you're the person they work for. So, you know, it's kind of a circular motion that ends up benefiting you, but of course that's the point, right? Politicians are meant to benefit the people.
How bad is our fiscal situation? Well, the federal government brought in $3.3 trillion last year and spent $6.6 trillion. The deficit last year, a record-busting $3.3 trillion. If you're looking for more COVID bailout money, we don't have any. The coffers are bare. We have no rainy day fund. We have no savings account. Congress has spent all the money long ago. The economic damage from this pandemic is not the reason for this runaway spending. This spending's been going on for decades. Every year, Even before we get to all the extra COVID-free money, we've been.
And of course, that's exactly right. Bush took the debt from 5 trillion to 10 trillion. And I'm being, kind of general with the numbers. It might be, give or take 500 billion. And Obama took it from 10 trillion to 20 trillion. And even before the massive deficit that we had this year, $3.3 trillion, as the senator just pointed out, we still had a deficit of $964 trillion, or a billion, last year, right? Which is larger than most of the deficits that President Obama had, by the way. That was while President Donald Trump was in office, of course, right? He was in office last year. I mean, the spending's been going on for a long time, and both parties are in on it. And the Bushes were in on it. The Clintons are in on it. The Kennedys are in on it. Reagan was in on it. Trump is in on it, right? This is an ongoing problem that has been going on for a long time, really all the way back to Woodrow Wilson.
Spending $1 trillion we don't have. Today's money is gone. So Congress is spending tomorrow's money. The spending chart is a red line of red ink that goes on forever. When we talk about spending tomorrow's money, it's not just the money that we need next month. It's the money we might need in a decade. It's the money we will need in 1, 2, 3 generations from now. For national defense, for infrastructure. This is the money that your children and your grandchildren will pay back with interest.
And let's just remind everybody, too, that on top of the stuff that the senator is talking about, it does need to be reiterated that it's not the government's damn job to pay your rent, right? Now, obviously, the government is the entire reason that you can't pay your rent at the moment in the first place. But that's where you solve the problem, by going back to work and getting the government's nose out of your business. Not by having the government be your nanny state and pay your rent and get you in a food line and all that other kind of stuff, or a bread line, rather.
The deficit doubling and tripling. Under George Bush, it went from 5 trillion to 10 trillion. Under President Obama, it went from 10 to 20 trillion. We're now at 27 trillion, but we're adding it at $1 trillion a year before we get to this COVID budget-busting bailout. Every tax-paying American already owes over $136,000, and they're staring at projections into the future that show no end. We are $27 trillion in debt today. How do we expect a child to have the economic opportunity when this crushing debt is their inheritance from Congress?
And by the way, it's not just the debt, right? It's also this economy where in some areas, like, for example, New York City, 80% of small businesses went under, right? It's also an economy where in numerous different, what would you call that, industries, for example, the restaurant industry, you don't know if you might be shut down next week over something that you had no idea even existed today, or even the day before you end up getting shut down, for that matter, right? It's a very volatile system. It's a system where everything relies on debt. And yet we expect people to actually be able to thrive in this system. It's not possible. It's not the way it's going to work.
The numbers are mind-boggling. It's hard to conceive of what $1 billion is, much less $1 trillion.
I want you guys to actually pay attention to this part, because a lot of people don't have any concept at all of what numbers are. I certainly didn't for a long time, right? So I understand it, but you need to have a concept of what these numbers mean, because they're huge dollar amounts that are insurmountable. And we will never pay this debt back, by the way. I hate to be the synagogue, but I am indeed the synagogue.
How big is $1 billion? Well, 1 billion seconds ago was 1988, and Reagan was president. 1 billion minutes ago, Jesus walked the shore of the Sea of Galilee. 1 billion hours ago, man still lived in caves. But $1 billion ago was just 80 minutes ago. $1 billion ago, at the rate Congress spends money, was just 80 minutes ago.
Now, you get the idea. He's a little bit off on some of the numbers. Really just one. Technically, it's 1,902.5 years for 1 billion minutes. Jesus would have been dead for roughly 100 years at that time, which would be roughly 128 AD. Not quite 100 years, but about 95 years. Nonetheless, though, you get the idea, right, of just how massive a billion actually is. That's just 1 billion minutes. 1 billion hours ago, at least according to the secular chronology, man still lived in caves as an ape, or at least a very, very, very primitive Homo sapien sapien. And like I said, a trillion, what would you call that? Excuse me, a trillion years ago, or not years ago, seconds ago, just seconds, 1 trillion, 32,000 years. Multiply that 27 times. And I don't really feel like doing the math myself, but you can go ahead, right?
All of this should be setting off alarm bells. But the only alarm bells in Congress are sounding the alarm for more spending and more debt. No cuts, no offsets, no pay-fors, no prioritization. Just print it up. Print up more money and give it out to everybody because it's free money. Come and get yours. Well, the getting's good, but it leads to a mountain of debt. Spend all this money and leave the future to figure itself out. John Maynard Keynes was once asked, what about the long run? He said, in the short run, you can make a stimulus, you can print money, and you can give it to everybody. And Maynard Keynes, his response was, in the long run, we'll all be dead. No concern for the future, only for the immediate. Our budget deficit for 2020 was $3.3 trillion, but this new spending package will also give us another $2 trillion in the next fiscal year.
$2 trillion of debt in 2021. 2021 hasn't even happened yet. It hasn't even happened yet. It's not even Christmas yet. And we've already added $2 trillion to 2021, making 2021, before 2021 has even began, the second highest deficit year in American history, second only to 2020, which, by the way, guarantee, my little hot take, 2021 will end up being more debt. It has to be. I mean, if you've already added $2 trillion before your usual deficit and before any of the other stupid decisions that you're definitely going to make with a Democrat Congress and with a completely incompetent Republican Party, right? It's guaranteed that we will have in 2021 spent more money that we do not have, printing it into existence, than the $3.3 trillion that we did that to in 2020. You mark my words.
By refusing to acknowledge the debt crisis, we are only hastening the day of economic reckoning. Total debt was 55% of GDP just 20 years ago. Today, it's 128% of GDP. So our total debt is more than our GDP, 128% of our GDP. The world.
And by the way, let me just point out too, this day of economic reckoning, friends, it will be terrible. It will be a horrible, horrible thing. Germany pre-World War II. Venezuela, in all the memes and videos that you saw back in 2017, right? That's what we're headed to. That is absolutely what we're headed to. This debt cycle is not sustainable. It's not possible for us to actually keep forward with this kind of economy. We can't do it. It's not the way numbers work. It's not the way economies work. It's not the way money works. And by the way, we don't even have an infrastructure to repair once we collapse. We don't own the means of production anymore. All of our businesses, whether they be simple businesses like call centers or, these nice rugged factories that we used to have everywhere in the Rust Belt, they've been outsourced overseas to people who get pennies on the hour. I mean, just being honest, right? This is what we have to look forward to. Barring some kind of miracle, which of course, is God's choice if he decides to do something like that. But we would need some kind of revival, I would think, in order for God to even consider something like that. Of course, that's just my own opinion, but nonetheless. Oh, not what I wanted. My apologies, friends.
The world World Bank estimates there's a tipping point of debt to GDP at about 77%. Every percentage point costs another tenth or so of economic.
77%. We're at 128%. That's 41% greater. We've almost doubled that quote tipping point that the World Bank has estimated. Doubled.
Economic growth. So every year we're giving up somewhere between 5 to 8% of growth every year because of this burden of debt. This is thousands of jobs every year.
I love that he says this burden of death. I know he didn't mean to, but I love that he did. I just personally have to think that was God ordained, because it is so accurate. If and when, because it's really not a matter of if, this economy collapses, people will die, guaranteed. The sick will die, the elderly will die, the children, the impoverished will die. There will be deaths. That is what happens when economies completely and totally tank, when people cannot get food, when people cannot put anything on the table for their children to eat, when people don't have medicine, when they start to get sick, when everything becomes nice and dirty because nobody actually has the money to maintain the infrastructure around. That's just the way that things go, right? People die over this. People died in the Great Depression. People died in the economic collapses in China after the Great Leap Forward. People died in the economic collapses after Joseph Stalin came to power. People died in the economic collapses in Venezuela and in the economic collapses pre-World War II in Germany. It's just the way it works. And we've gotten real used to this idea of recessions that happen in our economy, where in the end, these collapses don't actually mean a whole lot for the grand scheme of things. They might mean a lot for some individual people, and maybe there's even large groups of people, but in the grand scheme of things, the country's fine. But there will be a day of reckoning where the collapse is so great that in the grand scheme of things, the country is not fine. And I'll remind you, the Great Depression began in 1929. It ends finally in about 1945. That's 16 years of just economic hardship, nonstop, constantly. Suicides increase, drugs increase, crime increase, people starving all over the country, all over the world even.
Here, tens of thousands of jobs that we lose because of this burden of debt. We are borrowing and worsening this debt crisis in part because too many governors and mayors have imposed heavy-handed restrictions that crush business. It isn't the pandemic that's killing the economy. It's the government's overzealous response.
And of course, that's 100% accurate, right? That's 100% accurate. Diseases don't even really have the capability to kill jobs. It's just not how diseases work, right? Of course, it could be that just the economy collapses because a whole bunch of people are dying and everybody's getting sick, but that's obviously not what's actually going on. What is going on is that the governments of numerous states, cities, counties, and so on are actually forcefully mandating masks. At some point, it's probably going to be vaccines, closures, 6 feet of distancing, so on and so forth. Excuse me. Which is, of course, causing businesses to have problems when they're trying to run their businesses, specifically movie theaters, restaurants, lots of bars, right? Obviously, a lot of churches, even though that's not a business, it is something that's been very greatly impacted. And of course, this is another step towards the collapse of the United States economy.
It is killing the economy. The pandemic itself was disrupted, but Congress is being asked to help perpetuate these lockdowns. The more money we give to the states, the more they keep us in lockdown. Every bailout dollar printed and passed out to the governors only allows these tin pot dictators to perpetuate the lockdowns.
That is exactly true. Once again, Senator Rand Paul hitting it right on the money. And I got to say, I really like the insult tin pot dictators, because that is just a perfect representation of what these people are. Scum like Gretchen Whitmer, like Andrew Cuomo, like Gavin Newsom, like Brad Little, Tom Wolf, right? These dirtbags who have absolutely nothing better to do than absolutely destroy your lives, to punish you for having the audacity to worship your God, or decide that you want to teach people, or decide that you want to go out to the park, or decide that you want to put food on the table for your family or potentially for somebody else's family because you own a restaurant. People who are killing entire industries for their own agendas, for their own egos, because they like the power trip that they've received. It's absolutely sickening, frankly.
Rules are arbitrary and unscientific. Governors
and by the way, not even just arbitrary, but also applied so unevenly, right? How many gay pride parades happened this year? How many Black Lives Matter protests happened this year? How many concerts were allowed to move forward this year? How many people were allowed to go to a weed dispensary? Were allowed to go to a bar? Were allowed to go to not a bar, we're allowed to go to a liquor store. Bars were actually one of the ones that were heavily impacted. We're allowed to go to a liquor store, right? So on and so forth. We're allowed to go to a strip club, to a brothel, even if you live in the state of Nevada. Go gamble if you live in the state of Nevada or in Atlantic City. But you can't go to church. But in a lot of states, you can't vote in person. But you can't go to school. But if you own a restaurant or a movie theater, etc., you can't actually do anything with your business. Why? I don't know. Just don't feel like letting you guys be open for some reason. We don't want any of these salons to be open unless, of course, we want to do our hair. We don't want to have restaurants to have anybody gathered inside unless, of course, we want to eat with our friends. It's disgusting.
Mayors across the country are picking winners and losers. Businesses, some that have been in families for generations, are being wiped out because they're not allowed to open. Restaurants have to close their doors for indoor dining, but then they get told they can open at limited capacity. But then they are told they have to close again. And then they get told they can open outside, and then they're told they can't open outside. Confusing, doesn't even explain the half of it. Bars are told that they can only serve alcohol if people are sitting and not standing, and only if they have heavy foods on their menus. Restaurants are told they can serve outdoors, then they have their permission revoked after they've sunk time and money converting their restaurant to outdoor services.
And of course, that's an undue economic burden on the business owner, who then doesn't actually get any profit from all of the money that they put into making everything COVID safe because they end up getting shut down anyways. This is happening all across the country. And it's impacting more than just small business owners and farmers and etc. It's impacting franchisees and corporations even. Of course, the huge corporations are going to get off completely scot-free because they always do. The rich get richer. That's the way it goes. Just look at Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, the guys behind Alphabet. Look at their net worths if you don't believe me. But your business, the farmer down the road, the baker who makes donuts in a family recipe, going all the way back to his grandma, made the recipe in 1922, something like that. I don't know, whatever the story is. It's the local business that you happen to enjoy and participate in buying their products, right? Those guys, screw them.
But a caterer is told they can still serve outside. Businesses are told they have to close at an arbitrary time determined by government officials, as though the virus only comes out late at night.
Well, yeah, the virus is obviously a vampire or a werewolf or something. Oh, actually, no, that totally, makes sense, bro. Like it came from a bat in a bat soup, so you turn into a werebat or something, which is kind of like a vampire or whatever. So you got to be inside at 10 a.m., bro, or p.m. I don't really know how times work. Got to have some fun, I guess, right? I hope I'm entertaining to somebody. I'm certainly not entertaining myself.
A business in one zip code can open, but one in an adjoining zip code across the street has to close, as if the virus can't cross an imaginary line.
There's actually been some interesting developments like that here in my own state, where certain cities, such as the capital, Boise, have been going around to other cities where they do not have any jurisdiction, cities like Kuna, Meridian, Mountain Home, so on and so forth, right? And threatening with fines and with closure businesses that are not meeting the lockdowns, or not the lockdowns, the COVID guidelines that Boise City has put out, which of course they have no right to do. But just a little interesting addition to that.
Airlines are allowed to fly, but hotels have to limit their occupancy, so you may not have anywhere to stay when you get there. Mom and pop stores and specialty stores are forced to close, but big box store competitors are allowed to stay open. How is any business expected to survive with this kind of arbitrary regulation that changes from day to day? Meanwhile, many schools remain closed, despite overwhelming evidence showing kids can learn safely in person, which means parents can't go to work, which forces parents to leave their jobs and take care of homebound kids. Now, they have no income because the government forced them to leave their jobs to take care of their kids, and many kids are struggling with this improvised virtual school.
Excuse me. Sorry, friends.
The need for help is real. I hear it every day from Kentuckians and across the country.
Oh, wow. My apologies. Video's just about over. But, excuse me. Can't get to the mute because it's already all the way over on the StreamYard tab. Nonetheless, got just 8 seconds left. My apologies, friends.
But it's clear that government has worsened the economic damage and acted as the biggest obstacle to economic recovery.
They haven't just worsened the economic damage. They are the economic damage. They are the sole cause of this economic damage, my friends. There is no other cause of this economic damage. I forgot to put up my banner. Sorry, the empire has no cloth. Let me see what else we got here for the comments. A lot from Brother Nicholas. I appreciate you, Brother Nicholas. I don't know if anybody else is actually in the live chat. I know we're pretty late and the show's almost over, but let's see. I actually agree with a lot of that, brother. Agree with a lot of that. Specifically that this is greater than just egoism. It is certainly coordinated attacks against, I think, the church at large, small businesses, etc. It's perfectly fine that you spanned. I mean, if nobody else is going to participate, I'm glad that somebody has some thoughts on what I have to say. It proves that I'm not just, rambling into the wind and entertaining nobody but myself, right? It's one of my great fears with these YouTube videos, I'm not going to lie, is that nobody even cares and I have no impact. But of course, in the end, I only need God's respect, right? Nonetheless, I did just sort of derail myself by reading the comments. I probably shouldn't do that. There is a couple other things I wanted to briefly go over. We'll actually put this in the description below. Like I said, Congress passes $900 billion coronavirus stimulus. Pretty much old news for everybody at this point, but there is something like $600 to be passed to virtually everybody in the country. Excuse me, in the coming weeks as a result of this recent stimulus. After months of stalled negotiations and partisan squabbling, Congress passed $900 billion in emergency coronavirus relief, in addition to a $1.4 trillion omnibus spending bill to fund the government through late next year. The historic legislation is the second largest stimulus in U.S. history and comes more than 8 months after Congress overwhelmingly passed a $2 trillion stimulus in late March. The federal government has now spent a total of more than $3 trillion to combat the pandemic, so that's just by itself, all of course in the year 2020. But since the passage of the CARES Act in the spring and the absence of more until now, the U.S. has seen a resurgence of the virus with a record number of cases, deaths, and hospitalizations, and millions more Americans falling into poverty and losing their jobs. Now, of course, that's only partially true. It does need to be noted when it comes to everybody saying, we have these, massive deaths from COVID. Remember that it was the CDC themselves who said that only 6% of the people who have actually died from COVID have died from COVID alone. And that number comes out to something like, I think at this point, it's up to 16,000. It's not a big number. It's literally not even 1/4 of our yearly flu total. In a series of Monday night votes, the House easily passed the mammoth 5,600 page legislation through two separate votes on a bipartisan basis. Shortly after the package advanced in the Senate 92-6, and now heads to President Donald Trump for his signature. Hopefully he will veto it. Not that it'll matter, of course, because they have plenty of votes to go forward with the 2/3, but at this point I would do it on principle. Congress also passed a 7-day stopgap measure to keep the government running and give Trump time to sign the omnibus bill. I just said I was going to read this, but I'm just going to go through it. Since funding dries up at midnight, both parties indicated that the targeted coronavirus aid doesn't address all of the concerns, but many acknowledge that more aid will likely be considered after President-elect Joe Biden takes office next month, because we can just print money ad infinitum, right? The new coronavirus aid includes $600 in stimulus checks, $300 a week in enhanced federal unemployment benefits, new funding for the Paycheck Protection Program, which aims to help small businesses keep employees on payroll, and a myriad of other provisions aimed to help Americans and businesses with the economic fallout. The bill also funds the government through next September and includes a number of tax cuts, which I don't necessarily mind the tax cuts, of course, but where are you getting all this money? The thing about tax cuts is you're supposed to couple them with slashes in the government spending, not increases in government spending, right? You can't reduce the amount of revenue you're getting and also increase the amount of spending you're doing. That's just not how anything works. Quote, none of us think this legislation is perfect, but a big bipartisan majority of us recognize the incredible amount of good it will do when we send it to the president's desk, end quote, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky said earlier on Monday. Isn't it interesting how stark of a difference you have from that ridiculous spineless turtle McConnell and the brave, robust patriot that we just listened to in Rand Paul? The American people, quote, the American people have waited long enough. I'm glad for our country and we're moving ahead together, end quote, says Senator McConnell, excuse me. And we won't read the rest of it because we don't really have time. But you guys get the idea. They passed it. $900 billion, $2 trillion in debt added to next year, $3.3 trillion in debt for this year. Everything is absolutely terrible. The economy is going to collapse. We're all doomed, right? I mean, etc. But there is salvation at the cross. So I guess there's a little bit of joy for us. Nonetheless, my friends, if you like this content, which we are now finished with, and I'm going to end incredibly abruptly, so I'm sorry about that. If you liked this content, please do like, and please do share, and please do subscribe if you actually want to get more of this content. Ring that bell, and you'll be notified every time we go live or post a video. We have, of course, this podcast, our news/politics/economics, whatever you want to call it, conspiracy theory, whatever podcast, that is the Watchdog. And, of course, Unapologetics, which is an apologetics, theology, and faith-based podcast where we study religion and specifically our scriptures, the faith that is the Holy Bible. I also post debates here. I also post different, open rooms here sometimes. If you guys are interested in any of that stuff, please do subscribe. Obviously, if you're interested in all of it, that's 4 reasons to subscribe. But even if you're only interested in one, that's at least one reason to subscribe, right? We have Monday, Wednesday, Friday posting of Watchdogs, and Saturday and Sunday, if everything goes right, posting of Unapologetics, with the Saturday episode being an Unapologetics Light. Also, if you like the content that we do here, of course, you can contribute to our Patreon. We do appreciate any sort of support there, as well as the support of your view or like in general. And of course, you can like me, or follow me rather, on any of the different social media platforms that I'm on, which is basically all of them: Parler, Gab, Minds, Facebook, Twitter, etc. I'm also on BitChute and Rumble, where this video will be included and where I am currently posting Watchdogs. So if you want to go there, you can go there as well. I do want to point out that it is indeed more than a little bit of joy. The victory of Christ is the greatest of all victories. And it is definitely something to look forward to. And with that, friends, I don't have very much else to get on here today. Roughly perfectly at an hour, so that's nice. I do have a question before I go, though. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise? Shalom.